Africa has always had her seers. Long before the missionaries. Long before the colonial borders were drawn in blood. Long before the Bibles arrived in the hands of those who would erase what came before. Africa has always had her Imboni. This is the story of one such seer. A man born in a township. A man who lost his parents before he became a man. A man who saw light where others saw only darkness. This is the story of Nkosi Yomokosi Omoya Imboni uZwi-Lezwe Radebe. On the 8th of November 1977, a child was born in Gugulethu, a township on the windswept Cape Flats near Cape Town, South Africa. His birth name was Samuel Mbaiza. But his clan name, the name that would carry the weight of destiny, was Radebe. In African tradition, an Isitekazelo, a clan name, is not merely a surname. It is a spiritual identity. It anchors a person to their lineage, to their ancestors, and to the divine purpose written into their blood. The Radebe clan is a lineage of the Omohubi people, a proud ethnic group of South Africa with deep roots in spiritual leadership. The Radebe clan, within the Omohubi nation, had long produced spiritual guides. This was not coincidence. This was ancestry at work. And so when Samuel Mbaiza was born, the boy who would become Imboni, he was born not into an ordinary family, but into a lineage of seers. Gugulethu was not an easy place to grow up. Created under Apartheid's Group Areas Act, it was a township built to separate, to control, to diminish. But even there, especially there, the spirit does not abandon its children. According to TRSH sources, the signs of Samuel's spiritual calling began almost from the moment of his birth. At just 4 months old, there were already indications noted by family elders that this child carried something unusual. But it was at the age of 4 that the spiritual phenomena became impossible to ignore. Young Samuel began seeing things. Wherever he placed his feet on the ground, he saw multicolored lit candles burning, glowing, surrounding him. He was terrified. The visions left him unable to walk easily, unable to speak properly, paralyzed by a spiritual experience his young mind could not yet process. In African indigenous spirituality, such experiences in childhood are recognized as Isitunua spiritual messengers making contact with a child who has been chosen. For 2 years, the family watched as Samuel struggled. They did not understand what was happening. In many households, this might have been dismissed as illness. But in a family with spiritual ancestry, the elders knew to seek guidance. When Samuel was 6 years old, an elderly woman known for her spiritual gifts came to visit the family. She examined the boy. And she told them, "This child is not sick. His Isitunua, his spiritual guides are calling him." The woman performed the appropriate ritual. She placed a block of camphor. She lit a white candle and Isibane to acknowledge and appease the spiritual guides, making their presence known. And after the ritual, Samuel could speak again. He could walk without fear. The candles he saw on the ground disappeared. But the calling had not disappeared. It had only been acknowledged. Then tragedy struck. Samuel lost his father when he was still a toddler. And then, in his teenage years, he lost his mother. For many young people, such losses would break the spirit entirely. But for Samuel Radebe, the death of his mother became a turning point the moment he decided, with everything he had, to serve his creator. Johannesburg. Egoli, the city of gold. The engine of southern Africa. It was here that a teenage Samuel Radebe arrived, guided, he would later say, not by chance, but by the deliberate hand of his spiritual guides, who had predetermined this move as the beginning of his mission. In 1993, at the age of 16, Samuel joined the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, a Brazilian Pentecostal denomination that had established a considerable presence in South Africa. Within the UCKG, Samuel did not remain a quiet member of the congregation for long. He became known as a boy preacher. His ability to conduct healing services drew new followers. People came not simply for the church, they came for Samuel. The Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, UCKG, is a Brazilian-founded Pentecostal movement with millions of members globally. But even as his gifts flourished within the UCKG, something troubled Samoa deeply. He noticed it the way African pastors were treated within the church. The hierarchy. The subtle subordination. The continuation, even in a place of worship, of patterns that echoed colonial structures. He began asking questions that the church could not answer. Why, even after democracy, were black people still occupying the lowest rungs? Why was African spirituality treated as something to be discarded rather than celebrated? The answers would not come from within the walls of the Universal Church. They would come from the water. In 2006, Samoa Radebe made his way to the Vaal River, near Johannesburg. What happened there would change everything. At the Vaal River, Radebe reported a vision of profound significance. He saw a golden lampstand bearing 7 colored candles. Around it stood beings of extraordinary form, with abnormally large heads, their presence radiating a spiritual authority he had never encountered before. In African indigenous spirituality, a golden lampstand with 7 candles carries deep symbolic meaning representing spiritual light, national destiny, and the 7 colors of the African spiritual spectrum. The vision was unmistakable. Radebe understood. He was being called not simply to preach, not simply to heal, but to found a new African spiritual institution. One rooted not in the imported doctrines of colonial Christianity, but in the ancient, living wisdom of African indigenous spirituality. 2 years later, on December 5, 2008, Radebe made a pilgrimage to the Nkom River, also known as Blood River in KwaZulu-Natal. Blood River. A name soaked in history. In 1838, Afrikaner Voortrekkers made a vow here, a covenant they claimed with their god after defeating a Zulu impi. For many Africans, Blood River represented a cause, the moment when conquest was spiritualized and made permanent. On December 5, 2008, Imboni Radebe enacted a counter-covenant at this same river. Accompanied by a small group of followers initially called the Three Mighty, he performed a spiritual act of dissolution, seeking to break what he regarded as a curse imposed on the African people, and to restore African indigenous spirituality to its rightful place. The scene was set. The calling had been answered. What remained was to begin. In the tradition of African indigenous spirituality, the coming of an Imboni, a true national seer, must be foretold. It must be announced by those who came before. A true Imboni does not arrive unannounced. And so, long before Samoa Radebe was born in Guguletu in 1977, voices from across Africa were already speaking of one who would come. She was born around 1793, a child of the Eastern Free State, of a land the colonial maps had not yet claimed. Her name was Mansopa Ane Makita. Mansopa became one of the most celebrated spiritual figures in Southern African history. She was a rainmaker, a prophetess, a diviner. She advised King Moshoeshoe, himself the founder of the Basotho nation, and predicted the outcomes of battles. In 1851, she foretold that the Basotho would defeat British troops led by Major Warden at the Battle of Verwoerd. They did. In 1852, she predicted victory at the Battle of Berea. Again, she was right. She foretold the coming of motor cars people would travel sitting down, she said, and of aeroplanes, birds that would fly between earth and sky. She prophesied the rinderpest epidemic and warned against involvement in World War I. Mansopa died in 1908 at approximately 111 years of age. Her grave at Modderport remains a pilgrimage site to this day. But among the prophecies attributed to Mansopa and recorded within the tradition of African hidden voices, the research organization sponsored by TRSH was one that pointed toward the future. Toward a spiritual figure of the Omohlubi who would come and continue the work of African spiritual restoration. Followers of Imboni Radebe, including one community blog by Ankobo Empire, have recorded the tradition that Mansopa prophesied the coming of a Hlubi prophet before he was even born. Across the continent, in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, another voice had already spoken. Simon Kimbangu was born in 1887 in Dhamba, near Tisville, in what was then the Belgian Congo. He became a catechist for the Baptist Missionary Society. And then, in 1921, He had a divine call that would change the history of African Christianity forever. In just a few months of public ministry in 1921, Kimbangu performed healings that drew thousands. A sick woman rose from her bed and walked. A blind man named Ngoma reportedly regained his sight. The Belgian colonial authorities, terrified of what an African-led spiritual movement might mean, arrested him, gave him 120 lashes, and sentenced him to death, later committed to life imprisonment. He spent 30 years in prison in Lubumbashi, dying there on October 12, 1951. The Church of Jesus Christ on Earth by the prophet Simon Kimbangu, EJCSK, now has between 5 and 8 million members, the largest African-founded Christian movement in the world. But it was what Kimbangu prophesied from his prison cell and before that concerns us most here. On the 10th of September 1921, while in Manzansanda, Kimbangu delivered a prophecy that has been recorded and preserved by the Kimbanguist Church. In it, he spoke of the spiritual journey of black people, a long road towards spiritual maturity and financial independence. And he foretold the coming of a great figure, one who would carry 3 powers: spiritual power, scientific power, and political power. Kimbangu's recorded words include, "It will take a long period of time for a black man to acquire his spiritual maturity. This one will allow him to obtain his financial independence. Then, the 3rd step shall be fulfilled. In this one a great divine king will be born. He will come with these 3 powers: spiritual power, scientific power, and political power." Kimbangu also prophesied the spiritual independence of black people, tied, he said, to the advent of a king chosen by God. And he foretold the end of the humiliation of the African race. "I will liquidate the humiliation since the earliest times, they did cease to inflict on black people. For all races of the earth none has been as much maltreated and humiliated as the black race." TRSH identifies these prophecies as pointing unmistakably toward the coming of Imboni uZwi-Lezwe Radebe. Kimbangu also famously prophesied Congo's independence from Belgium in 1960, 9 years after his death. That independence came to pass exactly as foretold. 2 prophets. One born in the mountains of the Free State. One born in the heart of the Congo. Across centuries and across geography, voices were already speaking of one who would come. In 2009, the vision given at the Vol River and sealed at the Nkom River became a reality. Samuel Radebe left the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. And the followers who had gathered around him, many of them having attended UCKG services not for the church's theology but for the healing gift of this young man, left with him. They gathered in an underground parking garage on 14 Plain Street, Johannesburg. These were humble beginnings. A basement. Folding chairs. No grand architecture. No marketing budget. But the presence of something real, something ancient, something that had been waiting to be named. The institution was initially called the Revelation Church of God. In 2020, following further revelation, it was renamed the Revelation Spiritual Home, a deliberate move away from the vocabulary of Christianity and toward an explicitly African spiritual identity. TISH deliberately avoids words like church and religion, viewing them as colonial impositions. They prefer spiritual home and institution. From that basement in Plain Street, TISH grew with astonishing speed. The former Grand Synagogue of Johannesburg, a magnificent historic building, was acquired and lovingly restored as a TRSH spiritual center. A large building in the Marshalltown district of Johannesburg was constructed, seating 5,000 worshippers. Branches multiplied. Today, the Revelation Spiritual Home has more than 70 branches across Southern Africa, in South Africa, Eswatini, Botswana, Lesotho, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. An international branch exists in County Kildare, Ireland, and followers in the United States are working toward a center in Atlanta. Scholars from Cambridge University Press have documented TRSH as what may well be the largest Pan-African institution dedicated to African indigenous spirituality in the world. To understand Imboni Radebe's significance, one must first understand what African indigenous spirituality actually means and what had been done to it. For centuries, African spiritual traditions were systematically targeted by colonial powers and the missionary project. Ancestors were rebranded as demons. Seers were labeled as witches. Sacred rituals were outlawed. And an entire continent was taught to view its own spiritual heritage as something shameful, dangerous, backward. Imboni Radebe teaches, and Imboni is a spiritual guide who possesses immaculate spiritual foresight and indigenous spiritual wisdom. A prophet speaks for God, but an Imboni guides a nation. Imboni Radebe teaches that there is a crucial distinction: a prophet speaks for God, and Imboni does far more. An Imboni guides a nation, heals spiritually and physically, sees beyond the visible world, and is born into a lineage of seers not elected, not trained into the role, but designated by the Creator God, known in the tradition as uZwi-Lezwe. At TRSH services, healing is conducted using water, salt, and spiritual elements revealed to the Imboni. The Iziben, the sacred lamp, burns as a symbol of the spiritual light being restored to the African people. The cosmology of TRSH speaks of Isitunua, higher spiritual guides, Amadlozi, ancestors, and a creator God who has always been present in African life long before any foreign religion arrived. Imboni Radebe has also taken his mission beyond South Africa's borders. He has participated in global spiritual events, visited international dignitaries, and in November 2024, made a deeply significant visit to a detention center in South Korea to pray with and for a spiritual leader unjustly detained. Observers describe the moment as a powerful bridge between African spirituality and global conscience. In January 2025, at a ceremony in New York hosted by HJ International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership, Imboni uZwi-Lezwe Radebe was conferred an honorary doctorate recognition of a life that has reshaped the spiritual landscape of a continent. He was also appointed spiritual advisor to the Omohubi Kingdom, and serves as chair of the Interreligious Association for Peace and Development, IAPD, Africa. And Imboni's authority is established, in part, by the verification of prophecy. Imboni Radebe has made numerous prophecies over the course of his ministry. Among those that followers point to as having been fulfilled. Followers have reported prophecies concerning South Africa's electricity crisis, the load shedding that has crippled the country for years, as having been spoken before the full extent of the crisis was publicly known. Prophecies of social and political instability. Prophecies regarding the spiritual awakening of the African people, a growing return to ancestral traditions, which we now observe accelerating across the continent. What is documented, and what scholars from Cambridge University Press have noted, is the extraordinary growth of TRSH itself as a phenomenon. A movement that went from an underground garage to millions of followers in under 2 decades is itself a kind of fulfillment, the spiritual awakening of a people long told their traditions were worthless. Africa has always had her seers. Long before the world told Africans they were spiritually impoverished. Long before they were taught that the voices of their ancestors were demons. Long before their mountains and rivers were stripped of their names and given new ones in foreign tongues. The Imboni were here. And now, in Goguletu born Samuel Radebe, who became Imboni uZwi-Lezwe Radebe, in Kosi Yomokosi Omoya, king of the kings of the spirit, that ancient lineage continues. He is a man who saw candles where others saw only ground. A man who heard the river speaking when others heard only water. A man who, from an underground garage in Johannesburg, built a spiritual home for millions. Whether you are a believer or a seeker. Whether you are returning to traditions your grandparents kept or discovering them for the first time. The story of Imboni Radebe is a reminder. Africa's spiritual wisdom was never lost. It was only waiting to be remembered. Before we close, we want to say something important, and we want to say it directly. This documentary was made with deep respect and with a commitment to accuracy. Every fact we have presented was drawn from published academic sources, peer-reviewed research, journalistic documentation, and community records. However, and we say this humbly, we are human. We may have made errors. There may be details we could not independently verify. There may be nuances in the oral traditions and community testimonies that we have not fully captured. And there may be prophecies, events, and aspects of Imboni Radebe's calling and ministry that deserve fuller treatment than time allowed. If any information in this documentary is inaccurate, incomplete, or requires correction, we sincerely and genuinely apologize. We did not intend to mislead anyone. We encourage members of the Revelation Spiritual Home, scholars of African indigenous spirituality, community elders, and anyone with deeper knowledge to please correct us in the comment section below. This is a living conversation. African history and African spirituality belong to African people, and it is those people who must be the final authority on their own story. Njayabonga. Sayabonga. Thank you.